Hello, you're watching Give the People What They Want. Today is June the 25th. We have, it's me, Prasanth, and Zoe from People's Dispatch. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
And we are missing our comrade and friend Vijay Prashad, who's right now at a very important meeting in Caracas in Venezuela. We'll come to that, of course, in a few minutes. Like I said, today is June 25th. It's a very important day in India because it marks the anniversary, the 46th anniversary, in fact, of the imposition of the internal emergency. And this was in 1975 during the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi. Now, this was a very problematic day, a very dark day for India's democracy. Even now, there are a lot of accounts of it. There are a lot of reports of how people suffered. For nearly 21 months, democracy was pretty much completely suspended in India, and rulership and the administration happened to the whims and fancies of the prime minister and mainly her son Sanjay Gandhi as well. For India, which had become a democracy in 1947, this showed the extent of how easy it was to actually subvert this democracy. And ever since then, there were a lot of efforts immediately after those 21 months when Indira Gandhi was defeated to make sure that it would be far more difficult to do that. Now, of course, we are in 2021. It's been 46 years later. A lot of people over the past many years have been talking about the emergency a lot because for many of the people who lived through those days, these days, especially the past 7 years under the BJP government of Narendra Modi, these days remind them a lot of what happened between 1975 and 1977, those 21 months. Because while there has been no official declaration of emergency, there has been no formal subversion of democracy, so to speak. What we do see in India, of course, is the fact that there has been a hollowing out of institutions. There's been a huge lack of accountability. There's been a suppression. There's been attacks targeting of critics of the government. Laws are passed without the consultation of those who are going to be affected, despite opposition. So what we're seeing right now in India is, of course, not a formal emergency, but many have called it an almost maybe informal emergency, where the processes of democracy are very much alive. Elections are held, people go to vote. There is technically a free press, but many have raised the questions that are these actually fulfilling their roles when democracy can be subverted to the massive use of money power, which is where there's no accountability. When the press in various ways has been pressured, is playing a very sycophantic role. Many press organizations playing a very sycophantic role towards the government. Then really the question arises in terms of how do you what is democracy? Democracy is when there are checks and balances in place, when the will of the people is adequately reflected. So all these are very much big questions that are before India today. We are also moving towards another month of the farmer struggle. I believe it's the 7th month. And, again, same questions asked. The farmers who spent all these months on the outskirts of Delhi, talking about issues of their livelihood, but those in power really not listening to them, really not, concerned about them, while those supporters of those in power have called them anti-nationals, they've called them terrorists. Same thing with, for instance, student activists who have been protesting for, a better world, so to speak, for Hindu-Muslim, for religious unity, suddenly being declared terrorists, suddenly being declared, let's say, authors of some kind of conspiracy to disrupt peace. So a big challenge as far as India is concerned right now. And I think every year on the anniversary of this emergency, this is something progressives, people who want to build a better India, remember this anniversary and ask themselves the same question: that how do we make sure that those days, those difficult days when so many people were in jail, when there was a complete suppression of democratic rights, how do we make sure that those do not happen again? So it's something to, I think, reflect on in this show, because this is a show where we talk about people's movements of the present, of the past, and their organic links. Speaking about anniversaries, of course, another major anniversary being marked in Venezuela right now, which comes from a very different political trajectory, carries with it a very different sense of hope, a very different sense of promise for the world. Zoe, tell us what's happening in Venezuela right now, where Vijay is.
Yes. Well, yesterday, June 24th, was the 200-year anniversary, the bicentennial of the Battle of Carabobo. And so this battle was one of the crucial battles in the struggle for liberation from the Spanish monarchy in the northern part of South America. Simon Bolivar defeated the Spanish royalist troops some kilometers west of Caracas, Venezuela. And this is, in today's time when this same region of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, continue to face the forces of imperialism and the forces that want to dominate and colonize these lands. This battle and this anniversary is, all the more important. This was not the definitive, anniversary of independence, of liberation from Spanish rule, but it marked a very important defeat of these forces. And so right now in Venezuela, there are hundreds of social leaders, activists, trade unionists, leaders from political parties from across the world. We're talking Ghana, lots of places in the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, United States, all across Latin America. They're all gathered in Venezuela to commemorate this historic anniversary and to once again come together, to manifest unity against imperialism, against policies of the far right globally, and using that kind of this, incredible mystica and symbolism of the Battle of Carabobo to renew their efforts for unity and to fight against imperialism. And so for the last 4 days, people have been organized in different working groups, discussing the battle of ideas and the importance of communication, talking about women's issues, and, coming together again, across people from across the world in different political formations to discuss what is a united people strategy to confront these topics. And it's been really inspiring and really incredible. And then yesterday, when this bicentennial Congress, this global Congress concluded, there was also the 19th meeting of ALBA TCP. So as we know, sorry, there's a plane flying overhead right now. But as we know, ALBA TCP is a platform, the Bolivarian Alliance for Peoples of Our America, which is, was a big and important initiative of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro to create, Latin American unity in the face of U.S. imperialism, and to create a space where countries in the region could come together for economic agreements, for trade agreements, and also for building political power and developing other projects in other areas. So right now, leaders, again, from across ALBA countries, from Bolivia, from the Caribbean, a lot of different Caribbean countries, St. Vincent and Grenadines, Dominica, various countries there have gathered in Caracas also to commemorate the Battle of Carabobo, but to come together for, of course, this very important meeting of ALBA TCP. Again, in this light of people's unity. Of course, this is from the side of the government, so we've had a lot of government leaders, and they took really important strategic definitions on the key issues facing these countries right now, which, of course, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic, the region of Latin America has been very hard hit. And of course, with countries like Cuba, with countries like Venezuela, they have had the added challenge of dealing with the blockade and sanctions. And yesterday, again, this has just been a really good week of news for Latin America, because yesterday, during the summit, they announced that Venezuela would be buying, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but some millions of doses of Cuba's vaccine Abdallah. So, this is really showing the importance of having regional unity, of building between left projects, progressive projects, and what does that mean? How can that have, actual material manifestations to better the lives of people and not depend on imperialist forces for their charity or for their kind of breadcrumbs that they're going to throw at these countries. So really important time. The Battle of Carabobo, this anniversary, has brought a lot of really, incredible unity, incredible developments in the region. And I think that's it, really. And, in that sense, as I said, the vaccine cooperation has been really important throughout the pandemic. Cuba and Venezuela have also been working really closely with China and Iran to overcome everything that's been happening. So I just wanted to hear, Prashant, what's happening in Iran. We know there have been developments with regards to the U.S. and their continued aggression there.
Absolutely right, because it's interesting that you mentioned that one of the aspects talked about in the series of seminars was the battle of ideas, the importance of communication. It's something we also truly believe in. And it's also very clear that it's something that the United States is very worried about as well, because over the past few days, we got to know that about 33 domains, including that of Press TV, which is the Iranian news agency, have been seized by the United States. It's quite an unseemly sight, because you go to presstv.com and you have this glaring image which declares that this website has been seized by it's because the domain name, the US has control over that domain name. Press TV is still functioning at presstv.ir, I believe. But I think this raises a couple of important questions. First of all, the charge that's of course made is that the Iranians were spreading disinformation or misinformation, whatever you call it. Of course, what they mean in this context is that the Iranians were spreading information or publishing news which did not match the imperialist agenda of the US. And there's really no other explanation of that fact, because why would you go and seize the sites of, very legitimate mainstream news organizations? Nobody has questioned that. The Press TV, for instance, or Al Masira TV, which is run by the Houthis in Yemen, they've provided very vital information about not only their own countries, but about perspectives which almost never do not appear in the US mainstream media. So despite all this talk about, which the US and its functionaries are always happy to trot out about freedom of expression, about the United States and the West being this kind of beacon of hope where people from oppressed countries suddenly come to speak up, what we see is a very ugly kind of information grab, so to speak, or a step in an information war where you just sort of do it to make a point. And this is also especially depressing, especially unfortunate, because we do know that in Vienna right now, over the past few weeks at least, there have been talks to make sure that the US, to try to find out how the US can come back to the Iran nuclear deal. Now, yet again, we need to examine this situation, because we have 5 or 6 countries sitting together to try to figure out how the US, which walked out of the deal in 2018, can come back. Like, which other country would be allowed this kind of luxury where, you walk out of a deal and then you set conditions about how you think the deal is not bad. And some years later, once your government changes, everyone has to sit together to figure out how you can come back. And during all this time, the people of Iran have suffered due to blockades, due to sanctions. We've read about how the COVID-19 situation in Iran was objectively worsened due to the kind of blockade and restrictions Iran had placed. And right now, the Iranians and maybe the Russians, the Chinese, even the European countries are all working together to try to figure out how the US can come back, how some kind of relief can be granted to the people in Iran. And we have a step like this, which just serves to vitiate the atmosphere. Iran has a new president, of course. The United States and the West again going, calling and referring to him as some kind of arch conservative. And he may have whatever his politics is, that's a different matter. It's of course a far more nuanced matter than that. But again, we see this massive information war, and a step like this we talked about hybrid wars in the past, which are waged against countries like Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. And yet this is yet another example of a step like this, where you just seize those domains. So very unfortunate development. We need to see how in the coming weeks, whether this will impact the process in Vienna or not, or whether this will lead to, say, a fresh stalemate, because what the US, sections of the US establishment would like is a fresh stalemate. And it's a very simple reason, because they want to expand the contours of the Iran nuclear deal. So the deal was just about, nuclear processing in Iran. Now they want to make it about ballistic missiles. Now they want to make it about the so-called support Iran provides to various, various legitimate organizations in the region, which is Iran's business, because it's a player in the region. Whereas one thing we have often talked about in the past is how the US is not in West Asia, but it continues to dictate terms in West Asia about how how people should behave, how countries should behave. So all this pointing to a very dangerous trend. There was some hope that it would get better after Trump left. In some ways it has, maybe on Yemen, maybe in a couple of issues it has. but the broad thrust of US policy still remaining the same towards Russia, towards China, towards Iran, and for that matter, towards Cuba as well. And I think we saw a very good example over the past few days, both of the kind of absurd policies the US is following and also the support Cuba has. So we're going to talk about what's been happening globally at the General Assembly and even otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I mentioned before, it's been, a good week in Latin America in terms of international solidarity and kind of a real show of strength and perseverance against U.S. imperialism. And so this week, on Monday, scientists in Cuba announced in a press conference that their vaccine, the first Latin American vaccine, the first anti-COVID vaccine to be created in Latin America by Cuban doctors in Cuban laboratories, Abdallah, has 92.28% efficacy. So that is really impressive, an incredible victory. I mean, really just shows that even despite the blockade, Cuba goes to all efforts to put the people first, to put, the growth and focus on science and technology, on education, on strengthening public institutions for the people's good. And so this was obviously met with a lot of excitement and support. And then on Wednesday was another historic day because it was the UN General Assembly. And Cuba, since 1992, has taken to the General Assembly to use it as a platform, as it is, of human rights, of what should be, respect to international law, to denounce the criminal blockade that it suffers under the United States. And every year it's been presenting a resolution that essentially calls for an end to the embargo, highlighting the devastating impacts that it has had, not only on the economy, because, I mean, just to say a number, just in between April 2020 and December 2020, the blockade caused $3,586.9 million of losses to the Cuban economy. So that's a huge number. I mean, it's hard to even conceptualize, because this is money that the Cuban government, that the Cuban state, that the Cuban people have lost because the United States does not agree with their government, it does not agree with their policies. But beyond, I mean, what that number also kind of says is that what does that mean for the impact on the lives of people? And so this report, they also outlined all of the impacts that it has had on the Cuban people: access to healthcare, access to timely service, access to food, all of these things which it directly impacts. And the US often says, as it says in the case of Iran, as it says in the case of Venezuela, and of course, as it says in the case of Cuba, that this blockade, that these sanctions, that these unilateral coercive measures are not meant to be against the people, but against the people in power. But what we see in all of these cases, as you mentioned in Iran, as it is very clear in Venezuela, and as it's clear in Cuba, is that the people are the first to suffer, that they suffer from lack of food, lack of medicine, and all of these things. So, every year Cuba has taken to the UN General Assembly to present a resolution which calls for the end of the US embargo and the end of these measures. And, once again, this measure was passed with almost unanimous support. And I think what's really interesting, which many people have highlighted, is that the only two votes against this resolution, which is merely calling for respect of international law, basic, rights of the Cuban people and its government to have, autonomy and sovereignty. The only two countries that voted against were Israel and the United States. I think that's really telling, especially given the current geopolitical situation, and also to understand kind of the alliances that are created to maintain this domination. The US provides support to Israel, and, arguably, was a big part of, why it's there, in order for it to maintain its occupation of Palestine and its aggression against the neighboring countries. And Israel is extremely ready to repay that favor. I mean, really, it has no stakes in what happens in Cuba. I mean, of course, Cuba has historically been one of the biggest defenders of the Palestinian cause and condemning, the brutal Israeli occupation and human rights violations. But, why else would they be voting against ending the U.S. embargo? It's because they have clear allegiance to the United States and are very ready to repay the United States for all its support in suppressing Palestinians. So, I mean, this is, again, it's a very important victory because it shows that the consensus is against the United States. It's against its policy of genocide, which is what they call the blockade, one of the largest, mass killings of people in history, because this blockade has been going on for 6 decades. So, I think that's really important. We have to highlight these victories. We have to highlight these moments where it shows that the U.S. is isolated. And, it continues since its inception. Next week we have coming up, both in Canada and the United States, Independence Day, where they, created their bourgeois democracies and liberated themselves from colonial rule. And, both in the case of the United States and Canada, there's a long history there beyond its actions overseas, but of, colonialism at home, genocide at home. And we've heard a lot of recent troubling reports from Canada. Prashant, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So, like you said, it's, ironic because next week is Canada's so-called Independence Day. But the key question here is, of course, yet another tragic discovery that has come up over the past few days, which is that hundreds of unmarked graves have been found, yet again, of children, yet again from a residential school. So this is the second major discovery in the past few months. We saw another incident where around 250 graves were discovered. This time, the number of graves is around 750. The number of children involved could be around 600. This is it's atrocious. It's depressing, and it's almost difficult to explain because not explain, difficult to conceive of or difficult to accept, because you have, say, children, hundreds and thousands of children who were taken from their parents, children of various First Nation communities in Canada who were taken from their parents and who were put in these schools, many of these schools run by the Catholic Church, of course. And the whole point was to supposedly civilize them. And this happened over decades, up to the 1970s. I think the last school of this sort, which is called the Indian residential schools, even the name is, horrific. It closed only in the mid-90s. And, children from across various communities taken into these schools, separated from their parents, separated from their culture. There were multiple reports of torture, of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, and so many deaths that it's one of the most horrifying things these days. Been almost no accountability for most of these deaths. And even now, the official numbers of the children who died are unknown. The official numbers say it could be somewhere around 3,000, 4,000. The actual numbers, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which actually said that cultural genocide had been committed on the First Nation, on the people of the First Nations, on their children, and the actual death count could be in about 6,000, 7,000, of course, and it's still unknown. The mass graves that were discovered, there are, in many of them, there are no gravestones, I believe, which itself is a crime. So, in fact, the Cowessess First Nation, other First Nation communities have said that they're treating the sites of these mass graves as a crime scene, because, you not only give them the indignity of, after all the indignity they suffered in life, they do not even have the dignity of a name or recognition in death. And I think this is common, of course, both to in Canada it works in a particular way, but the assault, the genocide of First Nation communities, of indigenous communities, very common across the Western Hemisphere. Colonialism at its most brutal. People like to pretend that this was something, that happened maybe, hundreds or 200 or 200 years ago, and that's something in the past. We're sorry for it. We didn't know better, but that happened. Whereas what I think this shows is that many of these institutions continued, and I think community leaders have pointed out that this is not something that is just somewhere in the distant past. This is continuing today in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of the discrimination that many of these communities face. And I think that, and I believe, as far as I've read, we've seen media reports also, the fact that survivors who have been fighting for, compensation, survivors who are fighting for these crimes to be recognized, have been contested by the government. So it's not even that, despite all the voices that the Liberal government might make in terms of how, we're sorry and all that, when it comes to the system, they have been forced to fight, pay legal fees to actually get the kind of the compensation that they deserve. So I believe that this is definitely not the end of the story, because these investigations are still going on. After the investigation that in Kamloops residential school that led to the discovery of 250 graves in May, this one started, and there could be many more such horrifying stories which come. Over the past few weeks, we have seen media reports of some of the survivors of these schools talking about the treatment they face, and these are heart-rending videos because they talk the kind of the indignity and basically how they were treated as less than human is very, very difficult to listen to. And the impact of this still very much continues in people's lives, in the way governments function. And we're talking about COVID-19, of course. And last year we went to we went to the United States. We talked in the United States with representatives of the Navajo Nation as well, who were talking about how even today the structural, discrimination continues. And I definitely do believe that I think we're going to see a lot more of this. First Nation organizations definitely are going to mobilize for a much more, I think, stronger response from these countries in terms of recognizing the crimes, the genocide that was committed. So very, very, very difficult. It's a story that's very difficult to read, very difficult to write, very difficult to talk about. And I think it's something that everyone across the world needs to follow to realize the true nature of colonialism and imperialism, which continue today. So yes, that's something that definitely in the coming months we should be following up. And you're watching Give the People What They Want, and this is from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. We are going to do one more story, which is again very connected to this global web of issues, again from Latin America. Again, a story of resistance as well, because it's about bringing people into account, bringing those into account. Zoe, what's happening in Brazil right now?
Yes, well, I mean, you said it, Prashant. This is really the story of the moment. It's about resisting, a criminal government that refuses to favor the lives of the people, that refuses to, make any investments in safeguarding, the lives of the people. And this is the government of Jair Bolsonaro. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, he's been the example of exactly what governments should not do. I mean, not only did he, deny the severity of COVID-19, he called it a small flu. He called for using a medicine that, is not effective in COVID-19, and has continued to actually do this till this day. And then since then, once vaccine production started, he actually has been blocking really important deals with the Brazilian government and pharmaceutical companies for the purchasing of vaccines. This has come out recently, investigations that the Brazilian Senate has been carrying out in their investigation of Jair Bolsonaro and his, responsibility in the high number of deaths in Brazil from COVID-19. Just last week, Brazil crossed the really kind of horrifying milestone of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19. And I think, it's really important, as I think, I'm here in the United States, a lot of people feel, okay, COVID-19 is over. Everyone, here the vaccinations are widely available. People can go back to life as normal, whatever that means. That's another whole other thing to unpack. But this is, the virus continues. And as we've talked in this show at length, a lot of places across the world, because of the vaccine hoarding of nations like the United States, like European countries, and like, the actions of the pharmaceutical companies to kind of hoard these vaccines and, try to make profit from this, is that it's a reality that's very strong in many countries. So, in Brazil, we've seen some of the worst impacts, especially when we're talking about indigenous communities. The impact on indigenous communities in Brazil has been huge. And so, they crossed this 500,000 death mark, and there have been constant mobilizations to demand that Bolsonaro resign, to demand that he be impeached, all sorts for that he be voted out. And so last week, there was a huge mobilization. I mean, the estimates were saying over, I think it was 720,000 people that were out in the streets in over 400 cities across the country. This is a huge mobilization, really, really important. People from all sectors of society, from trade unions, from left political parties. A lot of indigenous communities have also been mobilizing, Afro-Brazilian organizations, because they've all been extremely hard hit by this policy of death, of genocide. And there are over and it's not just been on the streets, but people in parliament have been extremely, extremely active. And there are over 100 requests for the impeachment of Jair Bolsonaro. This is historic. I don't think this has ever happened in history. It hasn't happened in the history of Brazil. And I'd be interested to know if this has happened in other countries. Over 100 requests for impeachment of Jair Bolsonaro for, a slew of crimes, not only for having to do with pandemic, but, of benefiting these large landowners, for, calling for, allowing environmental devastation. And so all of these things, this Saturday, Brazilians are going to be out in the streets once again, demanding out Bolsonaro and an end to the genocidal policies. Their slogan is vaccine in the arm, food on the plate. And so I think this is really inspiring. We're with the people of Brazil, as always. And, no more of these governments that take advantage of the people and that do not protect them in a time where the people's lives have to be of the first order.
Absolutely. Vaccine in the arm, food on the plate is really a powerful slogan, I think, to end today's show with, because it represents it so simply and elegantly synthesizes some of the most important demands of our time, of the kind of issues we talk about in Give the People What They Want. You'll be hearing it in a podcast form soon too. We'll be definitely back next week. Until then, please go to peoplesdispatch.org, where you can find many of these stories. You can find the coverage of them, the follow-ups to them, many of them very essential. And as well as read articles from the Globetrotter system as well, where there is a lot of excellent opinion writing from across the world. So that's it for us today. Zoe, anything more?
No, the struggle continues. We salute the amazing victories of Cuba, of Venezuela, and they give us inspiration to go forward. So I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching.